Think of the first game you've ever played. It could be Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, or even Fortnite. No matter what game it is, you'll probably have a special place for it in your heart. For me, that game is Skylanders Trap Team. An oldie but goldie, Skylanders Trap Team released in 2014, and I beat that game probably 20 times in the same year. Recently, though, I had a conversation with an old friend who also liked the same game. We started talking about the chances of a new game in the franchise, or maybe even a remake of one of the other games. I had argued that a remake of one of the old games would yield better results than a completely new game. He, however, had argued that remakes are not successful enough, and that it could risk ruining the IP's reputation entirely. Then, eventually, we both just got stopped by the real question: what makes a good remake? First, I want to define what a good remake actually is, using this article by Seno. I want to focus on the first 3 points of the article. 1. Enough time and legacy. This point makes sure that the game in question has had enough time passed and that its legacy has been good enough that a remake of the game makes sense. Moving on to the second point, dual audience. This focuses on the reality that the older generation and newer generation will both be playing the remake, and that a remake in essence is going to target these two audiences, and its ability to tread carefully on this line will dictate whether we have a good remake or not. The remake has to make sure that it doesn't stray too far from the original concept while introducing newer and refreshed gameplay to appeal to the newer players. This concept ties in most with our third point, redesign experience. This point makes sure that the direction of the new game is fully modernized and optimized. Not just the direction though, but the character design and also main gameplay mechanisms need to be modernized or it doesn't count as a good remake. Now that we got the definition out of the way, I want to now give an example of what a good and bad remake is using the definition we stated earlier. First, we're going to talk about the Risk of Rain franchise. Giving you a little background, Risk of Rain was released in 2013 by a dev team of two people, Paul Morris and Duncan Drummond, a part of Hopu Games. It is a 2D roguelite action platformer with the focus of high replayability and a good challenge. The main mechanic of Risk of Rain, which gave it its independence from other roguelikes, was the increase of difficulty over time. Risk of Rain 1 was a big hit in the 2D platformer genre and had a steady fanbase all until the sequel, Risk of Rain 2, was released in 2020. After the sequel was released, Gearbox had bought the IP rights from the original developers in 2022. As a final goodbye to the community, Hopu Games decided to release a remake of the original Risk of Rain for those who wanted the same modern design of Risk of Rain 2, but on a flat surface. Risk of Rain Returns was released in 2023, and in my opinion, is the perfect example of a good remake. Going back to the criteria earlier, let's go through the points and see how Risk of Rain Returns uses these points to make a great experience. 1. Enough time and legacy. Risk of Rain Returns came out exactly 10 years after the first game on November 8th, 2023. That checks the enough time mark, obviously. For the legacy point, the first game had overwhelming success when it was released, and many people have been hoping for a new remake of the first game ever since the second game came out. The first point is checked. For dual audience, Hopu realized that both audiences will be playing their game, so what they did was remake the base game the exact way it was made in 2013, but with new assets and a cleaner UI. And they added mechanics on top of it so that they can keep both sides happy. Another way Risk of Rain Returns keeps the original is the classic Risk of Rain modifier in the player select, which allows the player to change the game settings to the original Risk of Rain settings if they want to play the old rules with the newer assets. Finally, for the redesign experience, Risk of Rain Returns added in a lot of new content. Too much to go over in such little time, so I'm going to speed fire them off right now. New survivors, new alternate abilities, Providence Trials, which are a new game mode full of minigames, new items and equipment, new enemies, new visuals and audio, improved multiplayer, modernized gameplay mechanics like strafe shooting and mouse aiming. You don't have to clear a stage of enemies to go to the next stage anymore. More accessibility options, more lore entries, update item interactions, and finally, new stage variations. So yeah, they added a lot, and enough for the redesign experience to be checked. Now that we have an example of what a great remake is, let's see how it could go wrong if some of these points aren't checked off. Resident Evil is a franchise that is highly praised for its horror adventure genre and its great storytelling. Resident Evil 3 came out in 1999 and had an overall good reviews and was claimed to be a good Resident Evil game. Fast forward 20 years, Capcom had started making remakes of the Resident Evil games and released the remake of Resident Evil 3 in 2020. While Capcom had waited enough time and had a good enough legacy to remake the game, the way Capcom had structured the remake was faulty, and it ultimately led to its demise and left a very big stain on the IP. The first problem was that Capcom did not build the game with the dual audience in mind. The original game had only zombies and a bioweapon named Nemesis that followed the player around the map, quietly stalking them until it randomly struck. Instead of it being a random encounter, they changed it so that Nemesis instead appears at the end of every level, which changed the horror aspects to a scripted event that would always happen. This confused the old generation and made the new generation feel no fear from the unstoppable stalker Nemesis was supposed to be. This game doesn't really know what it's supposed to be either, and is stated to be a series of annoying action encounters occurring in uninspired levels. With Nemesis being changed from an undefeatable stalker to a boring pursuer, the old and new audiences were left wondering where it had gone wrong. The redesign experience of the levels had also been changed, adding more boring enemies to the mix while adding new biomutant enemies that were annoying to play against since they one-shot the player. The levels themselves were also changed from horror-themed to revolve more around puzzles than the actual scare aspect. Another change that the community disliked was the cutting of story content that made the game significantly shorter, even though it had a higher price. These changes led to massive community outrage, and to this day, Resident Evil 3 Remake has left a bad taste in the mouths of many people who enjoyed the Resident Evil franchise. Now that we know what a bad remake looks like, I want to go back to Risk Returns and talk more in depth about how it really improved from the first game. Immersion. In Risk of Rain, you play as a survivor of a spaceship wreck who crash-landed in an escape pod on an unregistered planet. In my opinion, being able to actually feel like a survivor who landed on an alien planet with nothing but your own gear is the most important part of the game, and both games nail it 100%. Both games immediately trap you into the game with their captivating art style and your own want to explore. The one problem is that in the first game, you have to clear the entire stage of enemies before you can teleport to the next stage. This can slightly remove the immersion for a little bit before you kill the last enemy, since it is kind of annoying when you just get done with an exhausting teleporter boss encounter, and you want to leave this stage feeling triumphed, but get stopped when you have to go around the stage again looking for a stray Lemurian or Wisp. This can also waste time, which increases the difficulty and can overall just make the game feel less fluid. Risk of Rain Returns improves this by allowing the player to leave whenever they want as long as they finish the teleporter encounter, which improves the immersion and fluidity of the game drastically. Storytelling techniques. The story in Risk of Rain is not really told through dialogue or cutscenes, but through logs you get from just playing the game. Rather it being an enemy log or environment log, they give small tidbits of information that eventually you can piece together a story. Risk of Rain 1 had small and complex information in their logs, which made it hard for players to decipher the game's story, and led to a lot of confused people. In Risk of Rain Returns, however, using help from Risk of Rain's 2 technique in its logs, was able to construct an interesting story within the logs and tied up any plot holes or loose ends within the actual story. Finally, I want to talk about the choices and consequences of both games. In my opinion, Risk of Rain 1 is a considerably harder game, overall because of the lack of modern controls and optimization that the remake has. That being said, the choices and consequences are actually more dangerous in Risk of Rain, because Risk of Rain Returns improved optimization also improved things like boss and enemy AI, and they also reworked how some items worked, making some items a small detriment if you picked up without attuning to a certain player style. These were changed so that the strategic errors snowballed out of control, which caused a more intense roguelike experience compared to the original. The last thing I want to talk about is the effect on the IP itself. Since Risk of Rain Returns had followed the criteria of what a good remake is supposed to be, the overall reaction from the community was very positive. Both audiences were both proud of the remake and happy to play it, and to this day, Risk of Rain Returns is a very small community who still plays regularly. For Resident Evil, on the other hand, Capcom has received some backlash because of the sad release of Resident Evil 3, and while no statement has been made regarding the underdeveloped game, it seems Capcom has learned the mistake since the Resident Evil 4 remake was a significantly better remake. Remakes are very prominent in the video game industry in today's age, whether it be because studios are looking for a quick cash grab or a small franchise is looking to give a gift to the community. Remakes are definitely appreciated. However, remakes cannot just be made with no care in the world, and a remake with that notion does not release without criticism. As a Risk of Rain fan, it really excites me to see that so many people appreciate the remake and the franchise itself, and I hope to see it grow much more in the future. Thank you for watching.